Hi, I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, host of Highly Sensitive Money. I'm a money coach, certified financial planner, and a highly sensitive person who brings money and social justice together. If you're someone who feels deeply, can endlessly think through how one decision affects everything else, or has ever struggled with all the things that traditional financial thinking leaves out, you're in the right place. In this show, I chat with highly sensitive people on how they handle their money, and with money experts on how they cultivate social justice in their work. Questions? Please go to allthecolors.net and schedule a free 30-minute call. And I'm happy to share resources on investment management, money coaching, workshops, or anything else money and social justice related. Join us in this episode as we explore money and sensitivity while honoring that all of our well-being is interconnected. In this episode, I sit down with Lina Blount, Director of Strategy and Partnership at Quaker Action Team. Lina shares how a training in nonviolent direct action led her to spend over a decade organizing people-powered movements for climate justice. Together, we explore what it means to play the rebel role in social change. Lina also opens up about the spiritual grounding behind this work, from holding corporate leaders in the light during Quaker worship to asking the profoundly personal question, what am I comfortable profiting from? As Lina and I trace her arc from a student training that lit a fire to a multi-year campaign confronting the world's largest investor in fossil fuels, you'll hear how a movement chooses its role when others' pathways narrow. When the advocate's doors close, the rebel draws a new horizon. Welcome, Lina, to Highly Sensitive Money. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here to talk about yourself, your relationship with money, but most importantly, what you lead over at EQAT.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So we connected because I learned of EQAT's. I think I've known about EQAT's divestment from Vanguard for a few years, but I connected with Eve, who also works at EQAT, and she suggested that you might be the perfect person to really dive more into that. Can you share what you do at EQAT and also what took you to that role?
Sure. So I'm the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at EQAT, which means that I am the person at EQAT who works most with coalition partners, connects with people like you to keep an eye on our sort of strategic vision and the role that EQAT plays within the sort of broader movement ecosystem around environmental issues. And I came to this work, if we want to go all the way back, I grew up in rural Washington state. I grew up in a really beautiful area out by Mount Rainier. And I also grew up the daughter of a civil engineer. And so from a pretty young age, I think I had a strong influence in my life that material problems have material solutions. And, grew up in a family where we were definitely relatively well off. I maybe didn't recognize that as a child, but my parents were savers, and they were folks who really worked hard to support me and my brother. And that's something that I have come to appreciate more and more as an adult, and also as I've gotten into the work with EQAT, I think has helped me to approach these questions around individual investment decisions with a lot of compassion and curiosity for why people make the choices they make. But I got into sort of environmental organizing from, this very practical mindset, again, with the civil engineer father, and also from a mindset of care for creation, care for the environment. My undergraduate studies were in urban planning and environmental policy. I went into that for some time right after graduation and actually volunteered with EQAT for many years. So I was a student in the Philadelphia area and was introduced to EQAT through a training that they did at Friends Center back in 2011 on their first campaign, which was on PNC Bank's investment in mountaintop removal coal mining. And I remember at the time being really electrified by the training and, was studying policy, was studying these questions of how we as a species, manage our resources, share our resources, take care of people's needs, and take care of the planet. And here was an organization that had some really compelling analysis around the role of people-powered movements to move the needle on what was seen as politically possible, and also draw a firm line in the sand to push back against some of the worst practices of the fossil fuel industry and the financial institutions that profited off of those practices. So that training back in 2011 really lit a fire in me, and I've been connected to EQAT as a volunteer since then, and actually joined staff back in 2022. So I have now been on EQAT staff for a couple of years, and I kind of came back to EQAT as a full-time organizer because I was continuing to grapple with these questions that have been at the foundation from the beginning. How do we take care of our planet, and how do we take care of each other? How do we share resources in a way that's equitable and sustainable? And also, how do everyday people impact decision making and impact what's seen as politically possible? Those questions, I think, are relevant perhaps now more than ever in the United States. And I can say a little bit more about EQAT's sense of our role in social change, but that is certainly part of the story of how I got to this work.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. And I realized that we jumped in using the acronyms for listeners who might be here and are not Quaker. EQAT is Earth Quaker Action Team.
That's right. Yeah.
T is for team. And this is a main part that this is something that really drew me to Quakerism, is the faith in action. They're actually really focusing on not only saying the thing, but also doing the thing. And that's a lot of what I hear here. And I also, in your story of in 2011, being electrified by learning about mountaintop removal, I imagine you were in college at the time?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's always something so powerful. I guess this can happen at any age, but especially when we're young adults and we learn about something, it can really mark the direction that we end up taking in the long term. So I hear that in your story.
Absolutely.
While you were introducing this, you said a couple of things that I'd love to dive into. People-powered movements, the impact that everyday people can have on decision making. Mm-hmm. Can you share more about how EQAT thinks about that? And again, remember that a lot of the listeners may not be Quaker.
Absolutely. So EQAT is a little bit obsessed with this particular framework from a sociologist named Bill Moyer, not the television host, a sociologist famous from the 20th century. And he did a lot of research on successful social movements. And through his research, put forward this framework that there are 4 roles of social change that he saw in most successful social movements. So the way those 4 roles were taught to me through Training for Change, which is an organization based here in Philadelphia that does a lot of work around sort of movement strategy and things like that. The way I was taught the 4 roles was advocate. This is perhaps one that we're most familiar with, people who advocate within the existing channels of power for change, like lobbyists, like elected officials. That's one role, the advocate. Another role is the helper. We might be familiar with these through direct service organizations, for example, like the Red Cross or other organizations that seek to meet an immediate need. The other role he identified as organizer. Probably the most familiar example for folks of an organizer role would be a union. Their basic theory of change is about more people, more power. And then the 4th role he identified is rebel. And this is the role that pushes on what's seen as politically possible. These might be the Earth Quaker Action Teams of the world. In fact, we very strongly identify as a rebel organization. And this framework that Bill Moyer put forward isn't just identifying 4 different types of change making. He also argues there's a dynamic relationship between those different roles, and that successful social movements are the ones that most understand the dynamic relationship between those roles. So when the advocates hit the stone wall in their channels where they're advocating for change, but they're not making any progress. They need the rebels from outside to be putting forward a bold vision of what we might actually want. And that can shift what's seen as possible. It can shift what they're able to do. Also, helpers often kind of on the front lines get the most information about where people are and what they need. So helpers can help those advocates and those rebels and those organizers actually meet people where they're at, actually provide things that people are needing. And the organizers often are the folks most able to mobilize the largest number of people. So the rebels might have a vision, but the organizers might be the folks who get the most people in the streets or help create that broader mass leverage that might be necessary. So that is part of what might make a people-powered movement, a movement that isn't just powerful because of moneyed interest, isn't just powerful because it has one important elected official involved in it, but is powerful because it involves these broad swaths of the public working for things that people really need. So that framework of the 4 roles of social change is really core to how EQAT thinks of our piece of this puzzle of working on climate change. And it's part of our piece of the puzzle of going after Vanguard, the world's largest investor in fossil fuels. There are folks who are advocates who have worked on shareholder resolutions, who have worked on, studies of the impact of climate change on long-term investments. They have their piece to play in this fight. There are folks who are organizers, I think sometimes of Green Faith or Friends Fiduciary or other sort of faith-based investment groups that are mostly working to educate folks to reach as many people as possible. And then there's folks who are helpers. These might be the financial advisors of the world who are right there with clients who have questions, and they're helping people answer those questions and figure out how to invest in ways that reflect their values. And EQAT is very clearly in this rebel role, calling for a collective tactic, moving money out of Vanguard, which is part of this broader campaign internationally that's trying to move Vanguard in a variety of ways to take responsibility for the fact that they're the world's largest investor in fossil fuels. And again, we don't believe that our theory of change is the only one necessary. We just believe that we have a very important part to play. And so that's where this tactic of divestment and the strategies that EQAT employs fit into this broader framework, again, of context around Vanguard, but also context around the broader climate movement. Because we're at a moment where the science is very clear. We can't be expanding new fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly in coal, oil, and gas. And so when you have massive investment in the expansion of those things, we have to try and stop that for a livable future for all of us. So that's the context in which we find ourselves. And also we're just in a geographic context where Vanguard's in our backyard here in Philadelphia. So yeah, I'm calling in from West Philadelphia. Vanguard's global headquarters is in Malvern, Pennsylvania. It's about a 45-minute drive from me. So that's another reason that EQAT found itself in this campaign, is we have this sense of responsibility and accountability for being in the backyard of this Goliath organization that has a really outsized impact, not only on the financial industry, but on investment practices all around the globe. So if we were to move Vanguard to change course, it could have ripple effects in an incredibly powerful way. So that's part of why we find ourselves in the campaign. That's part of why we've picked up the mantle of being a rebel organization, is we think this framework of the 4 roles of social change also challenges us to look at the landscape where we're at and say, well, what roles are needed? Is there an overabundance of advocates? Is there an overabundance of helpers? Is there perhaps more of a need for strategic rebels to help shift what's seen as politically possible when our advocates hit a stone wall, like we're seeing in a lot of places in our country right now?
Yes, especially I was thinking about shareholder advocacy, which is part of the advocate. And there's been a lot of pushback this year on whether that's going to be possible at all. So that feels really disheartening.
Yeah.
The good thing is things come in cycles. I don't know how much time we have, but we just get to keep moving forward, keep working.
Absolutely. And what you're speaking to, the difficulty of momentum around shareholder advocacy right now, is a big part of why we think calling for divestment is important. We work with advocates who, have been in the trenches working on shareholder advocacy for years, who say that they used to have a regular conversation with folks at Vanguard. And in some ways that has come to a halt. Vanguard only supported 2% of sort of ESG or environmental sustainable governance shareholder resolutions in 2023, and then 0 in 2024. And as you said, you look at the political landscape, there is this question of how these resolutions might or might not continue. And so it is a clear moment where the advocates have hit some of the limits of what they have access to push. And it's where we need to shake up the landscape a bit in order to say, well, something different needs to be possible here. If we're really hitting a roadblock in this channel that has been lifted up for many, many years as the appropriate channel for people to enact change at these incredibly powerful companies, if you close off those channels, people are going to look for other channels to enact change. And that's our responsibility as change makers, right, is to continue reassessing our strategies.
And how long, so you said in 2011, EQAT had started with PNC.
Yeah.
When did it start working on this relationship with Vanguard?
That's a great question. At the very earliest, some of the actions were in 2021. As I mentioned, there's sort of been a global campaign around Vanguard, and there was increasing interest across the fossil fuel, or the anti-fossil fuel movement. There's been interest in the role of finance for a long time. Because fossil fuel extraction is such a capital-intensive endeavor, they need lots of loans, they need lots of other financial products to support these new pipelines or new LNG facilities to move forward. And so for a long time across the globe, campaigners have identified banks and other financial institutions as strategic targets to shift and potentially slow and stop the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. So there was some interest around the globe in Vanguard. As I mentioned, they have been the largest investor in fossil fuels. So you could pick just about any project, pipeline, incinerator, and follow the money back. And there's Vanguard as one of the largest investors in the parent company. And again, because EQAT was in Vanguard's backyard, different allies in the climate movement reached out to us and was curious if we were interested in joining that effort. So there's some initial sort of exploratory actions and research in 2021. And then we really sort of publicly and more intentionally joined the global campaign in April of 2022 when we marched from the city of Chester, Pennsylvania to Malvern, where Vanguard's corporate headquarters are. Chester is a predominantly Black community outside of Philadelphia. It has the largest incinerator on the East Coast is in Chester, and has a number of other polluting industries, all of which are industries where Vanguard's a major investor. So from the very beginning of our involvement in this effort, we wanted to connect the dots from the communities that are impacted by the pollution and the negative impacts of these companies to Vanguard, because they're quite insulated from these impacts in a variety of ways, geographically, but also I think it poses that quintessential justice question of who is profiting and who is impacted by the decisions of those companies that others are profiting off of. So we launched our involvement with that march. It's about 40 miles. So multiple people did multiple shifts over multiple days. And then it culminated in a big rally outside Vanguard's headquarters. And since then, we've done dozens of actions. We've held Quaker worship at Vanguard. We've also held Quaker worship near the homes of various executives. First, Tim Buckley, the former CEO, and then Salim Ramji, who came in as CEO last summer of 2024. And any Quakers listening may have joined our action in summer of 2024, where we had about 300 people and folks from frontline fights all over the globe join us for a massive demonstration at Vanguard's offices. And Quaker worship, we sat down in chairs and held in our hearts Vanguard leadership, praying that they would change course to protect the planet that we all share and the future that their children are inheriting, that we're all inheriting as well. So it's been now about 4 years, moving on 5 years. And yeah, we've certainly learned a lot in that time, I will say.
Yeah, and for anyone who has never been to a Quaker worship, it looks very much like meditation. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of silence. Sometimes people have messages to share. I don't know if there were messages during those worship sessions. But I can imagine like looking outside your house and seeing 300 people sitting down quietly, holding you in their heart. That's got to be quite a sight. I think one of the things that I love what you said, that a lot of the times with justice, it's like, if you can't see the harm you're causing, mm-hmm. then it's easy to pretend it's not happening. And I'm thinking, yes, we can move with Vanguard itself to be fossil fuel free. And I know that Vanguard does have ESG options. Mm-hmm. I don't know how pristine those might be, but really how in the world that we live right now, it's like investing can sometimes, as even when you're trying to be as pristine, as fossil fuel free, as private prison free as possible, sometimes things sneak in, especially into indices or mutual funds. At the beginning, you said that your parents were savers. And I know people who invest at Vanguard, mm-hmm. and that I've let them know about their fossil fuel footprint, right? How they're the main financer. And it can feel really scary for people to divest from something that's creating profit, mm-hmm. even when it's hurting, well, even when it's against their values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there resources that EQAT has created for that?
So a lot of what we do is point folks to other resources that other financial experts have created. So for example, I facilitate our money moving webinars usually every month. And I'm not a financial advisor nor a financial planner. So I'm always very clear in those conversations that I'm not giving anyone advice about specific alternative funds. What we're doing is walking through tools that are out there, and what I invite folks to do is to ask themselves what their values are with their money. And we actually do an exercise in the webinars of, if you had to pick your top 3 values for your money, what might they be? And you're really hitting on a point that I think is important, which is that return can be a value for a wide variety of very personal and important reasons. We live in a culture where there is not a significant social safety net for people. Most folks in the United States do not have access to a pension, do not have access to significant savings beyond what they do personally. Very few people have access to employer-backed 401ks, actually, and less. So those who do, and those who are able to save for their own retirements, it's a deeply personal thing to try and take care of yourself and your family and the people you love. Oftentimes, people are saving for dependents or saving for family members who themselves don't have the means to grow old with dignity and need support from children or other family members. So I really recognize and try and take time in our money moving webinars to acknowledge the context in which we find ourselves and some of the many, many deeply moral reasons people might want to maximize some of their return to take care of themselves and the people they love. And within that, I also just invite folks to consider what they're comfortable profiting off of, because our individual investments are one of the only places in our lives where we get to ask that question. It's very different than a consumer boycott where you're choosing to purchase a product or you're choosing, to shop at Target, for example, or somewhere else that company might be, making decisions you don't like. Our investments are one of the only places where we are the recipients of the profit. And so I think it's a really profound question to ask, what am I comfortable profiting off of? And to recognize that we have a system that has profoundly encouraged us to not ask that question and to not lift the hood on what's in our investments. The other thing I remind folks in these money moving webinars is that there's not really an industry standard around ESG. And you still have to lift the hood on funds that are marketed as ESG to see what's actually in them. And, we know that Vanguard has some funds it markets as ESG. Less than 0.5% of their total assets under management are in those funds. And when you lift the hood on some of them, which we do, we plug in the fund code into the As You Sow tool. That's one of the main tools we walk folks through, is the As You Sow fund tool. You can put in, VSGX, and then you can pull up and see, here's this fund that's marketed as an ESG fund that has direct holdings in coal companies, has direct holdings in a number of companies that people may not consider themselves to be truly sustainable. And so that's what we do in the money moving webinars. We invite folks to think about their values. We celebrate the context in which we might care about the return on our investments to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. And we invite folks to explore what they're comfortable profiting off of, recognizing that every individual will answer that question differently. So we walk folks through the As You Sow tool, which I highly, highly recommend. My favorite thing about it, and this is what I show people in our webinars, is that they show their work. If you want to know why this fund is getting a D in fossil finance, or what even fossil finance means, you can click and expand and see their methodology, see their definitions of terms. They show their work in almost every facet. And for most of the funds, if you were to search with the As You Sow tool, you can also compare them to an S&P benchmark. So again, if you care about return, you can see how these funds that might get an A rating around fossil fuels or an A rating around fossil finance or fossil insurance, you can see how that fund compares to an S&P benchmark over 5 years. So that's one tool we just walk folks through in the webinar. And then the other tool I share with folks, to shout out another Quaker organization, is American Friends Service Committee's Investigate tool. I love this tool. It is, I would hazard to say, slightly less user-friendly. You can only search by exact match for a company or a fund name. So you'd have to put in that code. So, I usually show the example with the VSGX fund with Vanguard. You can plug that in, and then you can see how that fund is exposed to other sort of issues of social concern. AFSC's tool particularly focuses on investments in prisons, occupations, and militarized borders. So they'll particularly tell you if a fund has companies in it that they recommend for divestment. So that's kind of what we do at EQAT in our money moving webinars, is invite folks to consider their values with their investments, celebrate the context in which we find ourselves, and then walk folks through these other tools that lift the hood and help you explore what's actually in your investments and start to think about what investments might look like that better reflect your values. So one of the things I really like about the As You Sow tool is you can filter by a couple of different terms and see a long list of funds that might meet those terms. So you can filter by positive 15-year return. You can filter by gets an A in fossil fuel investments, gets an A in exposure to military weapons. And then now you see a list of all of the funds that meet those criteria. So that's a lot of what we do in the Money Moving webinars. We don't give people specific advice about specific alternative funds, but invite folks into those tools and invite folks into exploring those questions for themselves, which, again, I really want to celebrate. We are encouraged not to explore. We are encouraged not to ask these questions. There's a lot of mainstream culture and other forces encouraging people not to investigate what's in their investments.
Yeah.
So
I really want to highlight that, because one of the things that I tell prospects, clients, is that if you're working with an advisor, you're working with someone in finances and you don't understand what they're saying, it's not on you as the person listening. It's on them. There needs to be a way for me to explain everything that I recommend to my clients in a way that they understand. Right? So I'll use a lot of metaphors. There are some things in finances that are incredibly complicated, like the PE ratios and like some of the subprime mortgages that happened in 2008. Like there are things that are really complex, but when you're saving for retirement, you're buying into a basket of goods. You're seeing how those goods grow over time. You're paying for people who are managing the goods, right? Like even although Vanguard is very low cost, there is an expense ratio. There's an amount that we're paying. When it comes to retirement, there is a way for this to be within someone's grasp. And part of my work so I'm an investment manager, but I'm also a money coach. As a money coach, I'm working with people who don't have $500,000, $1 million to invest. So they're more about like, how do I get myself set up to one day have that amount, or just to like live, to just be debt free, whatever it is, right? And with them, I focus on teaching them how to learn about these topics, helping them feel confident in themselves to go ask questions, finding some of the resources. So I'll definitely list the Never Vanguard page that EQAT has created that has a lot of really great resources, including other alternatives where people can find advisors. I think it's called Green America. The question of like, why are we discouraged from learning about this? When there's a lot of information asymmetry where like I know more than the consumer, then I can charge the consumer whatever I want, right? The consumer's just going to be giving their power to me as the investment manager without recognizing that in reality, it's the consumer, it's the client that gets to decide. It's always, even though I can make recommendations on how do I believe people should invest their money for their long-term goals, at the end of the day, it's their decision. Right? And then the phrase that you use, what are you comfortable profiting off of, is such a powerful, powerful question. And I mean, Quakers aren't perfect. We've been dealing with this question since there was enslavement. I learned recently. But did you know that a lot of Quakers in Philly came from Barbados who had enslaved people?
I learned that, a couple years ago. I think Quakers can tell a really sanitized version of our history. We only talking about the abolitionists instead of talking about folks who were enslavers and who were profiting off of that practice.
Yeah, and I think it's also part of like the wider culture that we live in of in some ways white supremacy, the inheritance of colonialism. You just go somewhere else and exploit them. Right? Or exploit the resources. And right now we're like, okay, here's this one planet that we have. Yes, there are still fossil fuels in the ground. And if we take them out, there's going to be no one left to enjoy this world. And the world itself is going to be devastated if we were to take all of that out. Like a change needs to happen within our lifetime.
Yeah, you might be familiar with, I think it may have been a New Yorker cartoon. It is a cartoon that I've seen where, there's a person sitting in a sort of tattered suit jacket around a fire in what clearly seems like a cave with a bunch of children. And the caption, the person's saying, yeah, we destroyed the planet, but for a glorious window of time, the quarterly returns were incredible. It's just like, right, like the logic here is it's just not sustainable.
Yeah. And there's so many different ways that we can help people make different decisions. And I love that you're working on having corporations themselves. I mean, if corporations get to be treated as people, why are they not worried like people about
Right.
the impact of their actions?
Totally. And I think we forget all the time that this is a relatively young industry. Vanguard is 50 years old. And we run into this often when folks, question, well, what can they really do with their passive investments and things like that. And my response often is, well, look at what they've done in the past. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they actually removed some Russian companies from index funds. So there's recent memory of Vanguard making some active filters on their quote unquote passive investments. So number one, look at what they've actually done. And number two, we made up these rules, like this industry is run by people making decisions, and if the business as usual is not compatible with a sustained planet, we have to make different decisions than what we're being told are possible. So that's the other thing I push back against quite a lot. And from just a fiduciary standpoint, there's increasing evidence that divesting from fossil fuels is a sound financial decision. The University of Waterloo has had a number of studies looking at public pensions in the United States and how much more money they would have if they had divested from fossil fuels 10 years ago. So that's the other thing, is there's good arguments from a variety of directions to make these moves, and that's what we're asking for.
Well, and I wonder, I mean, I love that at the beginning you say, like, there are material answers to material questions, but this is maybe somewhat ideological, right? If an organization decides to move away from fossil fuels, are they now really saying, actually, we believe, we know that climate change is happening, that climate collapse, that we are affecting climate? And I think for people who are denying that, any move that doesn't validate their choices can feel really threatening, right? So it's still, as material as investments are, the things that are moving it are not material, and they're hard to change.
Right. It's always fascinating when there are folks who insist that they are the pinnacle of logic and data. And when you show folks the data that they don't agree with and they refuse it, you're like, oh, well, okay. You actually have an emotional investment of seeing yourself this way. And you also have an emotional investment in this status quo that you might not be recognizing in yourself. And so when you're presented with data that refutes your position, if you're unable to accept that, you're not actually operating from a logical position. You're operating from an emotional one, which we're all human beings. It's all a part of how we navigate the world. But I'm always fascinated about how people might defend their position when presented with information that shows a different worldview. And I'm, certainly susceptible to this myself. I think we're in a moment in time where people can go online and cherry pick the data to reinforce their worldview. And I think all of us must be accountable to really looking at the range of data and information out there and be open to having our opinions shaken and open to learning and humble and accountable to making decisions that, we are responsible to our neighbor. We are responsible to look out for each other and to look out for the planet. And I'm Quaker. I can also come at this from a sort of religious standpoint of being a steward, of caring for creation. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating time in which we all, I think, are trying to figure out our piece of this puzzle within a context where it does feel like a lot of science is getting thrown out. And if it doesn't support the worldview of the powerful, it's ignored and attacked even. So it's very interesting to be doing this work in that landscape right now.
Yeah. And one thing I love about about being Quaker is that the tenet that the truth is continuously revealing itself.
Yeah.
And that brings in this kind of flexibility of like, okay, I chose to invest in the open market 10 years ago. And now I am deciding that I am going to change my mind, right? That now I have learned more. So I can have that inner flexibility to just kind of let people remember that they can change their mind.
Right.
And who knows? Who knows if things getting worse is often what people need in order to change their mind, to make the decision they could have made 5 years ago, 15, 20 years ago.
Right. I love that you name that tenet of Quakerism, that the truth is always being revealed, that it's continuing. I sometimes joke with folks in EQAT. I say, well, thank goodness the future is not bound by the limits of my own imagination. Because it keeps me humble too. I think to be someone invested in this work, you have to have a certain amount of faithfulness to change being possible. So it is almost a faith practice for me sometimes to do this work and to not get cynical, and yeah, just be grateful that the future is not bound by the limits of my own imagination, because it can be disheartening to look at the science around climate change and where we're at a federal level around action on climate, and believe that everything that we can save is worth saving. All the efforts we take are worthwhile. And I'm surprised by people every day in positive ways of what people are capable of doing, whether it's at the individual level of trying things they're afraid of and growing in their boldness and their courage, or at the collective level of achieving things that people didn't believe they could do alone. So it has to be a faith practice for me, especially now. And there's a discipline to it, like I have my low days where you just have to return again and remember that be willing to be surprised and be willing to learn all the time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I feel like that's a beautiful place to end our conversation. And one thing that I wanted to add is that for myself, as a money coach and an investment manager, I feel this work to be my ministry of where I'm helping people own their power in an area of their life that a lot of the times we're like, oh no, that's not for me.
Right.
I just have to put my head down and do exactly what mainstream tells me to do.
Right.
And I hear some of that in what EQAT is doing of bringing like, I guess, divinity, like that of God in everyone, into finances. And again, the way that you were protesting Vanguard was literally by holding people in your heart. Like that is such a faith and action way of moving. I remember years ago talking with someone about what had really impressed me about being Quakers. And it's that someone at the first meeting I went to said, like, how do we keep people in our heart that are inciting violence? And this person that I was sharing to was like, you don't put them in your heart. And that belief that like I cannot put someone in my heart, I mean, it's not true. Everyone's actions are interrelated. So I'm super happy to be Quaker and to learn about the work that you're doing and to send people to your monthly workshops on how to move money. Anything else that you would like to share with people as we're wrapping up today's conversation?
I just think it is a profound act of values to explore these questions. I'm always honored when I get to be in conversation with folks who are wrestling with these things.
Today, Lina reminded me that being a rebel isn't about opposition. It's about faith and possibility, about believing that people and even institutions can choose differently. Her story shows how action rooted in spirit, whether through a march, a meeting, or silent worship, can move us closer to justice in ways that data alone never could. I love the way that Lina and the Earth Quaker Action Team invite us to take responsibility for our money, our power, and our care for the planet by asking one simple question. What are you comfortable profiting off of?
Thank you for joining me on Highly Sensitive Money. I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, and I hope this episode helped you see how money and sensitivity can work together while honoring our interconnected well-being. We have the power to create a system where everyone's needs are met because nature is abundant. If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to leave a review and share this episode with someone who could benefit. Your support helps this message reach more people navigating their own financial journeys. A thank you goes to Mike Schul for the music and Juan Antonio Nunez for producing. For more resources on bringing money and social justice together, sign up for my monthly newsletter over at allthecolors.net. I also invite you to schedule a free 30-minute call where we can talk about money coaching, investment management, and all things money and social justice. Until next time, remember that your sensitivity and deep thinking is your superpower.